What if everything we consider progress in the modern world actually represents a profound philosophical regression? After decades of careful study of the great texts, I have come to recognize that modernity's most celebrated achievements, scientific rationalism, historical consciousness, and democratic egalitarianism, rest upon foundations that ancient philosophers would have immediately recognized as dangerously unstable. The modern project, which promised to liberate humanity from superstition and arbitrary authority, has instead created new forms of tyranny more subtle and perhaps more dangerous than anything the ancients feared. Today, we will examine how modernity's own internal contradictions reveal the superior wisdom of classical political philosophy, and why understanding these flaws is essential for anyone who hopes to think seriously about politics and human life. Chapter 1: The Modern Delusion of Historical Progress. The most fundamental error of modernity lies in its assumption that historical movement necessarily constitutes progress. This historicist premise, which pervades contemporary thought, suggests that later ideas are inherently superior to earlier ones simply by virtue of being later. Yet when we examine this assumption with the care that serious philosophy demands, we discover a circular argument of remarkable naivety. Modern thinkers from Bacon to Marx have insisted that human reason, properly applied, can master nature and create unprecedented human prosperity and freedom. But this confidence rests on a question-begging premise, that the criteria for judging improvement are themselves beyond question. The ancients understood what moderns have forgotten, that the most important questions about human life cannot be answered by accumulated knowledge or technological mastery. Consider how Plato's Republic addresses the question of justice. Plato does not assume that future generations will necessarily understand justice better than his own. Rather, he suggests that understanding justice requires a kind of philosophical insight that is equally available, or equally difficult, in any age. The capacity for philosophical reflection on fundamental questions does not improve through historical accumulation. It depends on the rare combination of natural ability and proper education that produces genuine philosophers. Modernity's faith in progress obscures this crucial distinction between technical knowledge, which can indeed accumulate, and wisdom about how to live, which must be rediscovered by each generation through careful thought. The result is a civilization that grows increasingly sophisticated in means while becoming increasingly confused about ends. This confusion manifests most clearly in modernity's inability to answer the ancient question, what is the best way of life? Modern thought systematically avoids this question by declaring it meaningless or by reducing it to subjective preference. Yet human beings cannot live without some answer to this question, and modernity's refusal to address it philosophically leaves individuals vulnerable to manipulation by those who are willing to provide answers, however sophistical. Chapter 2: The Collapse of Natural Right into Relativism. The modern rejection of natural right represents perhaps the most catastrophic intellectual development of the past several centuries. Beginning with Machiavelli's bold assertion that effective politics requires abandoning traditional moral constraints, modernity has progressively undermined belief in objective standards of right and wrong. What began as a tactical adjustment to political realism has metastasized into complete moral relativism. Ancient political philosophy, particularly as developed by Aristotle, recognized that human beings are by nature political animals who require objective standards of justice to live together successfully. These standards are not arbitrary human constructions but reflect the permanent structure of human nature and the requirements of political community. Justice is not whatever serves the interests of the stronger, as the sophists claimed, but an objective harmony that can be discovered through philosophical investigation. Modernity initially attempted to replace classical natural right with new rational foundations, the social contract theories of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. But these attempts contained internal contradictions that their authors only partially recognized. If individuals in a state of nature possess natural rights, where do these rights come from? If they come from human reason, Why should reason's deliverances be authoritative? If they come from God, how do we distinguish divine commands from human projections? The modern emphasis on individual consent as the source of political legitimacy eventually undermines its own foundations. If legitimate government requires unanimous consent, then any individual can withdraw consent and restore the state of nature. If majority consent suffices, then natural rights of minorities become contingent on majority will. The attempt to ground politics in individual choice rather than objective standards ultimately makes all political arrangements arbitrary. This trajectory leads inevitably to the historicist conclusion that all moral and political judgments are historically conditioned. What seems just to us appears just only because we have been shaped by particular historical circumstances. But this insight, when fully embraced, makes rational political discourse impossible. If all positions are equally historical and therefore equally arbitrary, then force rather than reason becomes the ultimate arbiter of political conflicts. The ancients avoided these difficulties by recognizing that political philosophy must begin with careful attention to permanent features of human experience rather than with abstract theories about hypothetical states of nature. Chapter 3: The Tyranny of Scientific Rationalism. Modern civilization prides itself on the triumph of scientific rationality over superstition and tradition. Yet this supposed liberation contains within it a new and more subtle form of tyranny, the reduction of all meaningful questions to those answerable by scientific method. This scientistic prejudice, which pervades modern education and public discourse, systematically excludes from serious consideration the very questions that matter most for human life. Science, properly understood, is a magnificent tool for investigating the material world and discovering efficient causes. The ancients, particularly Aristotle, recognized this and developed sophisticated methods for studying nature. But they also understood that scientific knowledge, however extensive, cannot answer questions about the purpose of human life or the nature of justice. These questions require a different kind of investigation, philosophical rather than scientific. Modernity's error lies in assuming that the scientific method, because it has proven so successful in natural science, must therefore be the only legitimate form of rational inquiry. This assumption leads to the systematic devaluation of moral and political philosophy. If ethical judgments cannot be verified experimentally, then they must be mere expressions of subjective preference. If political arrangements cannot be derived from scientific laws, then they must be arbitrary constructions of power. Consider how this affects education. Modern universities increasingly organize themselves around the model of scientific research, measuring success by quantifiable outputs rather than by the cultivation of wisdom or character. Students learn to manipulate data and apply methodologies, but they receive little guidance in thinking about fundamental questions of meaning and value. The result is technical competence combined with philosophical illiteracy. But perhaps even more dangerous is how scientific rationalism transforms politics itself. When political problems are treated as technical problems requiring expert solutions, democratic deliberation becomes unnecessary and even counterproductive. Why consult the opinions of ordinary citizens when social scientists can determine the optimal policies through empirical research? This technocratic approach to politics eliminates what the ancients recognized as essential to political life: the ongoing conversation among citizens about justice and the common good. It replaces the political art of persuasion with administrative technique, reducing citizens to clients and statesmen to managers. The ancient understanding of practical wisdom, phronesis, provides an alternative to both arbitrary subjectivism and scientific reductionism, recognizing that political judgment requires a form of rationality appropriate to human action rather than natural necessity. Chapter 4: Democracy's Threat to Excellence and Philosophy. While modernity celebrates democratic equality as an unqualified good, careful examination reveals that democracy, unchecked by classical wisdom, poses serious threats to both human excellence and philosophical inquiry. The ancient philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, understood democracy's attractions but also recognized its dangerous tendencies toward mediocrity and mob rule. Democratic ideology insists that all opinions are equally worthy of consideration and that majority will should determine political arrangements. This egalitarian premise, when extended beyond its proper sphere, undermines the very possibility of distinguishing better from worse in any meaningful sense. If all viewpoints are equally valid, then the philosopher's claim to superior insight becomes illegitimate elitism. But human beings are manifestly unequal in their intellectual capacities, moral development, and practical wisdom. Some individuals have greater ability to understand complex arguments, control their passions, and make sound judgments about political affairs. Democratic equality, pushed to its logical conclusion, requires denial of these obvious facts about human nature. The result is a systematic lowering of standards in education, culture, and public discourse. Democratic societies tend to reward those who appeal to popular prejudices rather than those who challenge citizens to think more carefully. The mass media, democratic politics, and commercial culture all operate according to this logic of lowest common denominator appeal. Even more troubling is how democratic egalitarianism affects the pursuit of truth. If intellectual authorities have no greater claim to credibility than popular opinion, then rigorous inquiry becomes pointless. Why struggle to master difficult texts or develop careful habits of thought when all conclusions are ultimately matters of personal preference? This creates what we might call the tyranny of the majority opinion, where social pressure enforces conformity to prevailing beliefs. The ancient philosophers faced persecution from democratic Athens, but at least they could distinguish between popular opinion and philosophical truth. Modern democracy tends to eliminate this distinction entirely. The classical alternative does not reject democratic participation but rather insists on the need for education that prepares citizens to participate thoughtfully in political life. This requires recognizing that some individuals have greater capacity for political wisdom and that democratic arrangements must be structured to encourage rather than discourage the cultivation of excellence. The founders of the American Republic understood this tension and attempted to create a system that would combine democratic legitimacy with protection for minority rights and encouragement of excellence. But subsequent developments have steadily eroded these protections in favor of direct democratic control. Chapter 5: The Theological-Political Crisis of Secular Rationalism. One of modernity's most profound contradictions lies in its simultaneous dependence on and rejection of religious foundations for moral and political life. The modern Enlightenment promised to establish rational foundations for ethics and politics that would make religious authority unnecessary. Yet the attempt to create a purely secular rational order has produced not clarity but deeper confusion about fundamental questions. The ancient philosophers recognized the complex relationship between philosophy and religious belief. They understood that most human beings require religious conviction to live moral lives, while simultaneously recognizing that philosophical inquiry might lead to conclusions incompatible with popular religious beliefs. This created what I have called the theological-political problem. How can philosophers pursue truth while maintaining the religious foundations that make decent political life possible? Modernity attempted to solve this problem by eliminating its religious dimension entirely. If reason alone could establish moral principles, then religious authority would become unnecessary. But this solution created new difficulties that its proponents failed to anticipate. If moral principles derive from human reason rather than divine command, what makes them binding? If they represent mere human constructions, why should anyone feel obligated to follow them? The social contract theorists attempted to ground moral obligation in self-interest, but this approach ultimately undermines genuine moral commitment. If I follow moral rules only because doing so serves my interests, then I will abandon them whenever my interests change. A morality based purely on calculation cannot sustain the kind of devotion that political communities require. Moreover, the attempt to eliminate religious authority from public life creates a vacuum that other authorities rush to fill. Secular ideologies, nationalism, socialism, scientism, often function as substitute religions, demanding the same kind of unquestioning devotion while lacking the intellectual sophistication and moral restraint that traditional religious thought had developed over centuries. The crisis deepens when we recognize that democratic society depends on moral convictions that democratic discourse cannot adequately defend. Why should citizens sacrifice personal interests for the common good? Why should majorities respect minority rights? Why should anyone prefer truth to comfortable illusions? These questions require answers that transcend mere procedural arrangements. The ancient approach suggested that philosophy and religion, properly understood, could coexist in a relationship of creative tension. Philosophy pursues truth without limits, while religion provides the moral foundation that makes civilized life possible. The wise statesman understands both the necessity of popular religious belief and the importance of protecting philosophical inquiry from religious persecution. Chapter 6: The Art of Noble Rhetoric versus Modern Propaganda. Perhaps nowhere does the superiority of ancient wisdom over modern practice become more evident than in the contrast between classical rhetoric and contemporary political communication. The ancients understood rhetoric as a genuine art requiring deep knowledge of human nature, careful attention to circumstances, and commitment to justice. Modernity has replaced this noble art with sophisticated techniques of mass manipulation that corrupt both speakers and audiences. Classical rhetoric, as developed by Aristotle, recognizes three modes of persuasion: logos, rational argument; ethos, character of the speaker; and pathos, emotional appeal to the audience. Genuine rhetoric integrates these elements in service of justice and truth. The skilled orator must understand the subject matter thoroughly, establish credibility through demonstrated virtue and wisdom, and appeal to emotions that support rather than undermine rational judgment. This classical understanding assumes that political discourse should elevate both speakers and audiences. Citizens become better people through participation in serious political conversation about important questions. The rhetorical art serves the philosophical goal of helping human beings live better lives in political community. Modern political communication operates according to entirely different principles. Public opinion research, focus groups, and psychological manipulation techniques allow speakers to achieve desired effects without concern for truth or justice. The goal is not to educate citizens or improve their capacity for judgment, but simply to secure compliance with predetermined objectives. Contemporary political campaigns exemplify this degradation. Candidates say whatever polling data suggests will prove most effective with target demographics. Complex policy questions get reduced to simplistic slogans designed to trigger emotional responses. Citizens are treated not as rational beings capable of thoughtful deliberation but as collections of psychological triggers to be manipulated. The mass media accelerates this corruption by rewarding sensationalism over substance. Stories that provoke strong emotional reactions receive more attention than careful analysis of important issues. Politicians learn to communicate through sound bites and photo opportunities rather than sustained argument. Even more troubling is how this affects the speakers themselves. The classical understanding insisted that genuine rhetoric requires the speaker to embody the virtues being advocated. One cannot persuade others to be just without being just oneself. Modern political communication severs this connection between character and effectiveness, producing leaders who excel at manipulation while lacking wisdom or virtue. The remedy requires returning to classical standards for political discourse, insisting on rational argument, demanding evidence of speaker credibility, and cultivating emotional responses that support rather than undermine sound judgment. Chapter 7: Rediscovering Ancient Wisdom for Contemporary Crisis. The crises of modernity, moral relativism, scientific reductionism, democratic mediocrity, secular confusion, rhetorical corruption, are not merely academic problems but existential challenges that threaten the possibility of civilized life. Yet these very crises create opportunities for recovering ancient wisdom that previous generations, intoxicated by modern progress, were unable to appreciate. The path forward requires what I have called a return to the ancients, but this return cannot be mere antiquarian nostalgia. We cannot simply ignore the intervening centuries or pretend that modern developments never occurred. Rather, we must engage ancient texts with fresh eyes, reading them as our contemporaries and teachers rather than as historical curiosities. This means developing the art of careful reading that allows us to discover what the great philosophers actually taught rather than what later interpreters claimed they taught. The classics contain resources for addressing contemporary problems, but accessing these resources requires the kind of patient, attentive study that our age systematically discourages. Consider how Plato's analysis of democratic corruption illuminates contemporary political problems, or how Aristotle's account of practical wisdom provides alternatives to both relativism and scientism. These insights remain available to anyone willing to undertake the intellectual labor necessary to understand them. But recovering ancient wisdom also requires creating institutions that can sustain serious intellectual life. This means reforming education to emphasize depth over breadth, encouraging genuine liberal arts study rather than technical training, and protecting spaces for philosophical conversation from commercial and ideological pressures. Most importantly, it requires cultivating individuals capable of living philosophical lives, people who prefer truth to comfortable illusions, wisdom to mere cleverness, and virtue to success. Such individuals have always been rare, but they become indispensable when civilizations face fundamental challenges to their founding principles. The philosophical life offers resources that neither modern science nor democratic politics can provide, a way of understanding human existence that takes seriously both our highest aspirations and our permanent limitations. Philosophy cannot solve political problems through technical fixes, but it can clarify what kinds of problems we face and what kinds of solutions are possible. The great books of the Western tradition remain our best guides for this investigation. They represent centuries of accumulated wisdom about perennial human problems. Reading them carefully, with attention to both their explicit teachings and their hidden depths, provides training in the kind of thinking that contemporary crises demand. This is not a call for political reaction or cultural nostalgia, but for intellectual seriousness about fundamental questions that modernity has systematically evaded. Conclusion. The fatal flaws of modernity are not accidental byproducts of otherwise healthy developments, but necessary consequences of abandoning ancient wisdom about human nature and political life. Historicism, relativism, scientism, egalitarianism, secularism, and rhetorical manipulation all follow logically from modernity's founding premises. Recognizing these connections allows us to understand why piecemeal reforms cannot address our deepest problems. We need fundamental reconsideration of modernity's philosophical foundations. The ancients provide indispensable resources for this reconsideration, not as authorities to be accepted uncritically, but as partners in the ongoing conversation about how human beings should live together. The choice before us is not between ancient and modern, but between philosophical seriousness and intellectual complacency. Those who choose philosophy will find in the great texts of the past their most reliable guides for understanding the present and preparing for an uncertain future.